preliminary remarks, but yeah, if there's anything that came up, I mean, I don't know how many years and years I've spent on this topic, but yeah, it's quite a lot. So I've heard
questions.
I've heard of a lot of.
Okay, question right here from Ken.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Doctor. I heard that they did dating of rocks at Mount St. Helens using traditional techniques, and they came up to be millions of years old, even though the eruption occurred in our lifetime. Have you heard or corroborate that information?
Yeah, but there is a way to. It's hard to explain. Radiometric dating is they say all the different dating methods agree, but it's kind of subjective, and it depends on how the method was done. Like let's say potassium argon, for example. Argon is a gas, but if the lava or whatever from the volcanic material ends up underwater, it doesn't degas as fast, and so you maintain extra argon in there that makes it have an appearance of age. And so there's supposed to be ways to detect for that extra argon that didn't degas, that's not due to radioactive decay. But then those methods, depending on what part of the rock you sample, they can be inconsistent. So I haven't found them very convincing in the argument that says they all agree. Well, there's different dating methods and they don't all agree, and especially when you have radiocarbon on top of it. I keep saying, like, radiocarbon is the biggest problem for evolutionists because it keeps showing up places where it shouldn't. Yeah, so radiocarbon is like a strong young Earth, or not young Earth. I'm what I would call a young life creationist, not a young Earth creationist, because the way the Bible describes the formation of the planet, and when you start reading Genesis, it seems like something was already here. It says the Spirit was hovering over the surface of the deep, and the earth was without form and empty. It doesn't say it wasn't here. It just said it wasn't formed so it could support life. So I think there's probably something here. The rocks may be very old indeed, but living things and sedimentary layers in which they were buried, those are all young.
Question here.
Yes, I have two questions, maybe one now and later the other one. If you could explain a little more the theory of something coming out of nothing. I think they're basing the fact because everything balances to zero, the electrons and the gravity and all that. But zero doesn't mean...
Zero is misleading. Let's say you have a lake, right? And it has perfectly flat lake. So the lake has no ripples, so they would call that lake zero or a nothing. They would call it nothing, even though it's a lake. So in the quantum computer that they're talking about that makes all these universes, the quantum computer is the lake. And so when he says it all balances out to zero, no spin, no charge, whatever, in other words, there's no ripples on the lake, right? So if you make a ripple on the lake, you can make it go upward or downward, so negative and positive. So what he's saying is that all the things that go down, bubble downward and bubble upward, they actually all balance out to zero, but you still have the flat lake, right? So it's not like it's nothing, it's just that the lake hasn't been disturbed, so you have no universe.
So the fact that they say that it takes no energy to create the universe, isn't that the proof that everything already was there, balanced out? It's just that we're taking stuff that is balanced out. And
well, to be honest, it's hard for me even to wrap my mind around, because when you take physics, there's this idea that there's a fabric to the universe, and that even empty space has density. It's starting to sound, quantum mechanics and all this is sounding really bizarre. But there's some evidence that the universe is based on vibrations, like almost like a musical instrument. And that if the string is not vibrating, you have no matter. But there's still the string there, but you can't see anything. You can't see any matter, but it's still there. It's sort of like this quantum lake. And it's similar in some ways to me that when God speaks things, they pop into existence, right? So when he speaks, he vibrates the strings and something appears. But so Michael Kiko could be correct in saying everything balances out to zero, like the string. You can get the string if you do all the pluses and minuses. The string has no energy, has no spin, has no nothing. But that doesn't mean the string isn't there. The fabric of the universe is still there. So my big thing with Michael Kiku is that he doesn't explain the information. For me, everything is information. All this, everything that's solid, the tables, the chairs, my physical body, to me it's all a mental projection. And there's actually some physical theories, physicist theories, in mainstream physics that suggest everything is a mental projection. That it's all information. The fundamental, if you go down, it's not atoms and quarks and smaller. If you get to the smallest basic thing that there is, it's not physical, it's information. So everything is information. In other words, we're all in the mind of God, and it starts to sound a lot like Paul describes it, like in him we live and move and have our being, right? So without God thinking of you, and even Bible talks about this, you're always on his mind. He knows every hair of your head that's numbered and blah, blah, blah. And if you ever forgot about something, it would just not exist, because everything's dependent on God moment by moment for its existence. That's kind of the way I wrap my mind around it, is everything is a mental projection. So everything is information, nothing is physical. And so in that way, I agree with Michael Kiku. Yes, the universe is for free as far as physical stuff. There may not be any physical stuff fundamentally. It may all be information, but you're not talking about the information, if that makes any sense at all.
Okay. More information in the form of a question from Dr. Follett.
I have lots of questions, but I recently heard something about the ice in the Antarctic. Didn't agree with some of that agrees with the dating, the long Earth dating, and that I have a brother who's in geophysics, and he said the layers in the bottom of the ocean agree with their long Earth dating, and I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, well, the ice first. The ice, mostly, there's studies in Greenland and Antarctica, right? And they drill cores down in the ice, and they're layered like tree rings, right? Because every winter storm brings in and makes a layer, right? Well, the problem with ice core dating is that you can physically count the cores on the top, which is pretty good. You can 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Just like tree rings. But as the ice goes down lower and lower, it gets spread out and thinner, so you can't see it with your eye. And so how do they count the rings? Well, they count the rings using chemical analysis, right? So they analyze the summer and winter isotopes for oxygen and other things, and they count these layers of isotopes, and they count those as rings, as annual deposits, where even though you can't see it with your eyes. So then I started asking myself, well, how reliable is that? And what is the range of error? And it turns out that in between the ice crystals, there's liquid water, even deep down in Greenland ice sheet. And the liquid water moves around, and it carries isotopes with it, and then it layers the isotopes artificially. And so these layers aren't necessarily annual layers. In fact, they can't have once you go down 1,000 feet or so, the resolution are like decadal averages. You can't be sure. And so what they do then is since they can't be sure in order to calibrate themselves, they use little fragments of volcanic ash that they trace back to their origin, and then they date the volcano when they think it exploded, right? So after where we actually know when the volcano exploded based on historical references, after you go back 4,000 or 5,000 years, it's all conjecture based on radiocarbon dating or radiometric dating, like potassium argon and all those things. So it's no longer a separate dating mechanism. It all reverts back to radiometric dating. And if there's a problem with radiometric dating, this isn't like something that confirms independently. It's still based on radiometric dating after you go down just a couple thousand layers. After that, then it's all like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's circular reasoning. I don't know if that helps. But the ice core dating is not independent after within historical time frames. So this idea it's 100,000 years old, they only determined that based on standard radiometric dating, not independently counting the layers, because you can't do that. Yep.
Okay, back here in the back, then to the front.
The ocean layers?
The ocean layers are different, but there's similar problems.
Someone asked a question. Who did that?
I didn't cover the ocean layers, I just
Okay,
covered
ocean layers.
the ice layers. So the ocean layers are different, but part of the problem with dating these layers, like lake bed layers and ocean layers, is that it's an assumption that each layer represents a year. And if you have a catastrophe going on, like worldwide, like floods or whatever local catastrophe that may put down more silt or more layers, you can have multiple layers in 1 year. So this idea that it represents each layer as 1 year isn't solid. And how do you know whether it is or it isn't? Well, you confirm it based on radioisotope dating. And again, back to circular reasoning again. So it's not independent. After a point, it's all based on the same idea. It's all these ideas that they all agree with each other, they only agree because they calibrate relative to each other. And so that's not helpful. You have to have something independent to be a separate calibrator. Otherwise, if you calibrate everything by itself or the same stuff, you're going to get the same result every single time. So it's not independent, is what I'm trying to say, if that makes sense. Yeah.
How big was the footprint on Crete?
Oh, regular human footprint. Heel toes, like a regular human footprint.
That was an easy one.
Yeah.
Now to the front.
Just going to comment on your Greenland example with the layers are not actually years. I'm sure you're familiar with the squadron of planes that was covered in World War II, and you probably remember the numbers better than I do. By the time somebody decided to dig for them, how many layers?
It's like 600 layers.
It would have been 600 years if they'd gone by there.
There's a plane that landed in World War II on the Greenland ice sheet, and it got buried by ice. So they figured, well, they'd go back and they'd find it under like 50 layers. Well, it was like 600 layers because every storm that comes in lays a layer. That's why they use the isotopes, the summer, winter isotopes. So they don't really actually rely that much on the layers, on the visual layers, at least in Greenland, because they're thicker. They don't really count the layers visually. They use chemical analysis and base it on summer, winter isotopes.
I have a question while no one else does. Oh, excuse me. Dr. Bob. I said that backwards. Bob, and he didn't pick up on it.
Thanks. Are there any models or explanations used by creationists that are no longer sound due to advances in scientific understanding? And kind of related to that, how have the models been updated to account for the new data?
Yeah, creationists can be your worst enemies. So you get these things, there's all kinds of different ones creationists fall for. Like you see these things on the internet with they find giant skeletons, for example, and they show you pictures. I get these all on a regular basis. Oh, they found this giant skeleton here, this head this cranium that's 6 feet tall, and blah, 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 and these huge giant footprints, and also these footprints in Paluxy River with dinosaur tracks all together. Those are all hoaxes. They're all fakes, but creationists fall for them all the time. Actually, Leonard Brand and Arthur Chadwick, they went to Paluxy River and they looked at the human footprints with the dinosaur tracks, and they took cross sections of them, and they proved that in the dinosaur tracks, what happened is that it was an impression, and so you could see the curve of the rock so it's a real track. It curved it down as the dinosaur stepped in the mud. It curved you could see the layers curve down. But with the human tracks, there was no curve down, it was carved. So it was a fake. So there are no human artifacts associated with dinosaurs or in the fossil record that I know of that are real. And so people ask that all the time. Well, why is that here? There's Noah's flood. Why aren't there any large mammals like lions and bears and woolly mammoths, in the Triassic, or humans? There's not. All the ones that I've been presented with are either unprovable or absolutely fake. And so I was like, those are not good arguments for creationists to bring up. And so the question is, well, why aren't there those things? Because that would seem like if the Bible were true, there should be something like that throughout the fossil record. And I was like, I don't have a definitive explanation for that except to say that the fossil record is kind of zonal. Like you find animals where they lived in real life. The mollusks and worms and everything are in the lower levels, and the reptiles and birds and things like that are higher levels. And it's more distributed with plants because there are some evidences, some pretty convincing evidence of flowering pollen in the very lower levels, which is inconsistent with evolutionary theory. But as far as humans being in the levels and larger mammals, there's some suggestion that mammals float and bloat when they die in water, and so they would have not been buried like the reptiles who sink more quickly. That's not that satisfying. The other is that they're maybe better at escaping, or I find most satisfying is that the human population may not have been that large, and the animals may not have lived in the lower levels initially. And so Anne Ellen White says that the larger populations of humans were completely destroyed under mountain ranges, like ground to bits. And there's no trace of them left. I don't know why God did that, or why we don't have anything at all that I know of. So I wish we did, but we don't.
Say that again, what she said, that humans were what?
The bigger towns and cities were buried under mountain ranges, and like totally wiped out. Like you won't be able to find any trace of them
Yet. Okay.
yet. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question about something you said with regards to meteorites, or a large meteor rather, that was causing this ripple effect to go around the globe and then bounce back and stuff. I was largely confused with regards to how those ripples could have gone across the Earth and then had footprints in different layers like that. It wasn't very clear to me. Where did that theory come from, and can it become more
Well,
clear?
let's say you have a bathtub with like 2 inches of water in it, and it's a big bathtub. And you make a big splash on one end, and the ripple goes away, but it's dry where that impact was for a while, until it bounces off the end of the bathtub and comes back. And then it wipes over again, and now you have water over it. And every time the wave comes over, like if it's a tsunami, a giant, and some of these are 2,000 feet tall or larger, and when that washes over, it takes most of the volume of the water with it, and so the water behind it, it's like when you go, if there's a big giant earthquake off the coast somewhere and all the water recedes, and it's all dry there. So the big volume of water that goes with the tidal wave will leave the back part dry for a while, exposed and all muddy, and the animals will be able to walk around. And then once it goes all the way around the globe or hits something and bounces back, then it will make another layer over that spot of sediment.
How does that not kill the life that is already there if it's 2,000 feet of wave? That's what I'm...
It probably did kill something every single time it went through, but then some areas may be more protected. It may have been behind a ridge or something and like diverted it around a little bit, and until it went over that ridge, maybe some of the critters survived for a while there, you know. So, but I mean, animals are tenacious for life. They're going to survive for a while, and they can swim, and for a while anyway, until they lose all their energy and then finally succumb. The flood wasn't just a simple flood. It took more than a year, and it was catastrophic. It wasn't like the water gradually went up and gradually went down. There were asteroids hitting all over the place, bam, 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 and stuff going off. It might have been calm in this area for a while, and a big catastrophe in this area for a while. It was very chaotic. And it's interesting, Ellen White describes it, says that the ark would not have survived, even as well built as it was, if angels weren't specifically sent to protect it. And then I'm sure everybody was getting seasick in there. So then to take pity on them, she said he sheltered it in a cove of mountains. Yeah. Right? So anyway, it was a catastrophe. It was a really bad situation.
It's kind of like the churches sometimes. Really bad, but it's the best place to be. Anyone else?
So I was talking about some animals like the muskox, and Brother Hardman here said, well, how does that come up? Because it sounds like he was a cold climate animal, and does that tie in with the Ice Age? And when I read Maxwell's Bible stories, he didn't say anything about the Ice Age.
Well, it might have been cooler, but it wasn't an ice age because they were actually eating buttercups and savanna-like situations with massive grasslands, and then they were killed all in one season. It's like millions of them all died together. All different kinds of animals all died together in one season. So it's like the ice age hit, bam, all of a sudden. And why would that happen? If you have a bunch of volcanoes, let's say 500 massive volcanoes all around the globe spewing up sulfuric acid into the atmosphere, it will shield the sun, and it will cause a sudden cold snap if there's enough of it all of a sudden in the atmosphere.
Did it tilt the Earth or something?
I think the Earth was probably tilted because the septicircadian rhythms, for example, humans don't seem to be perfectly tuned to a 24-hour day. We're more like, I forget exactly what it is, but they've taken people in caves and studied them, and it's more like 25 or 26 hours. So I think that whatever impacted the Earth not only tilted the axis, but may have slowed it down or sped it up or something. Changed it from its original setup, probably. Oh, one more thing about creationists and crazy arguments. Creationists often say, and says genetics is my thing, that mutations, random mutations, are always detrimental. That's a common argument. That's not true. There are beneficial mutations that actually, there's even gain of function mutations, there's even ways to get novel enzymes and things like that by random chance. But and so to say that all mutations are bad, that's not true. It's just that most of them are. And what is true is as you go up higher and higher levels of functional complexity or minimum structural complexity, as you consider higher functional systems, what is true is that it becomes exponentially harder and harder to get those systems by random chance. It's not impossible, it just takes exponentially longer and longer periods of time. So what we do see in real life is gain of function. Usually it's reversion mutations where you had a function and you lost it because of a mutation, like blind cavefish, for example. Single point mutation will remove the eyes of a cavefish. You can get the eyes back through a reversion mutation that corrects the original bad mutation, right? So you can say that's a gain of function, but it's really a gain of the original function. But you can also get brand new, entirely new functions that never were there before by mutations that are gain of function, but they always are based on small proteins, less than 100 amino acids. I haven't found any gain of function that involved a minimum of more than 200 specifically arranged amino acids. And then when you sit down and do the math, once you get over about that level, you can realize that if you have a large population of bacteria, like billions of bacteria, you can do that sort of level of evolution within a reasonable amount of time, a few months, a few years. Antibiotic resistance is another one, but that's usually based on, antibiotic resistance is usually based on a disruption of a pre-existing interaction between the antibiotic and the target within the bacterium. So if you break a finger on the interaction, you block the antibiotic target interaction, you gain antibiotic resistance. So it's usually a destruction based on a pre-existing interaction. But you can get brand new functions that way, but it's always based on small enzymes. Brand new, it's like generating a 3-letter words. You spin the dial for 3-letter words, 1 in 18 times you're gonna get a new one, right? Just by random chance. But it becomes exponentially harder and harder as you get higher and higher levels of functional complexity. So that's one of my most frustrating ones that creationists I hear always say is that all mutations are bad, but that's not true.
Look at the person next to you and say, you look like a very positive mutation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I just lucked out.
Yeah. So you look like a very positive mutation. So I'd like some questions from students. We've had one student, I think, which is, I like the adults too, but students, please ask questions, make the university look good so our speaker will come back.
Tell us about the Ice Age. I'm right here.
Oh, there you go.
I'm interested to know, because I don't know how that happened. I kind of believe that it did.
What, no?
I'd like to know about the Ice Age. How do you see that as having happened? I know you spoke a little bit about it already, but I'd like to hear more.
Oh, I believe it happened because of the volcanoes. During the continental drift, you generate, like there was a volcano in the fossil record in Washington State that covered a third of North America with ash, right? The huge volcanoes during this time. And it would only make sense because you have rapid continental drift during an immediate split because of asteroids, massive asteroids hitting all the time. They would create giant volcanoes, and sulfuric acid is part of what a lot of volcanoes release into the atmosphere, and it's reflective. So it starts reflecting solar rays, and it really cools off. If you want to cure global warming, make a giant volcano, right? It'll cure it for years and years. Like mini ice ages and things like that in Europe, and you hear about it in England, these mini ice ages during the 1700s and things like that. They were caused by volcanoes. Massive volcanoes that went off that cooled off the whole planet. If it happened, you can look, there's historical evidence. This has happened in our history.
Okay.
Oh, the Ice Age, I think, happened about 600 or 700 years after the flood. Because right after the flood, like I said during the lecture, it was very warm because of all the sudden energy release. And that warmth took a while to cool off from the planet, and then once you start blocking out the sun rays with all the volcanoes going off, like I think the Bible talks about it, in the days of Peleg, the earth was divided. Maybe that was like a people population, but it could maybe also be talking about continents separating as well in different places. And if that happens, you get a lot more volcanoes. You can get a sudden cold snap at that point. But before that point, obviously, there was a while where the whole planet was warm. There was no ice caps even. The Arctic Circle was very lush, had thick grass and forests with fruit-bearing trees. So it had to be warm. It wasn't like it was today for several hundred years at least. I mean, how long, you could sit down and how long does it take for how many mammoths? 7 mammoths to produce 5 million mammoths. It takes a few hundred years to do that. And the people also ask me, well, how do you explain like sloths getting to South America from Noah's Ark, and turtles and stuff? It's like, well, a turtle half a mile a year. When you have 1,000 years, it'll get there eventually. Because the ocean, in other words, the oceans were so low, especially after the Ice Age hit, that you could walk all the way around the globe on dry ground or ice. That's how the Eskimos and American Indians got across the Alaskan land bridge all the way down through North America and then into South America. It was all dry. You could walk. You didn't have to take a boat.
Southwest Airlines wasn't there yet.
Yeah.
We have a question here in the back, and then another brave person, Rahel, over on the right.
Okay, I have a question. We learned this whole weekend about, threshold concepts, and you were explaining, different biological concepts with that. But when we are asked, about creation, like, how do we formalize all the concepts that we've learned this weekend? How do we, what are we supposed to, say? But also how to, assess it, what things we should say in the beginning, what we should say things, at the end of our points that we should say. So how do we communicate that?
So what do we do with all your information? She wants to know how to put together some glow tracks.
It's hard, I'll have to admit. I mean, I have good friends of mine who are extremely intelligent who are not convinced, right? I think they're nuts, but they think I'm nuts too. So, and we still hang out and play golf and have a good time, but it's hard to convince somebody who doesn't want to be convinced or who's not willing to sit down and it's like Isaac Newton said, if you just want to think about it superficially, you're not going to figure it out. You have to put some serious time and effort into it in order to wrap your mind around it. And if the person's not willing to sit down and really struggle through it and figure out, well, let's go through the actual math. How long would it take a random mutation starting with this type of sequence of this length to get to this type of sequence, and what are the odds that how populated is sequence space? And all these concepts are not something that you just pick up, falling off a log. You really have to struggle with it. I took maybe 10 years before I thought the sequence space idea, because sequence space is not three-dimensional or two-dimensional. I showed you a checkerboard, right? But how many, let's say you have 1,000 amino acid protein. How many dimensions does it take to hold those 1,000 amino? It's just a sequence of 1,000 amino acids in a string. How many dimensions does it take to hold that string? It takes 1,000 dimensions. So doing the math is, you can do it mathematically, but trying to visualize it, impossible. So it took me a while to just get my mind around that.
So we have another question here, but as you're answering that question, be thinking about what kind of resources would you use to answer her question? Would you point her to
There's some
YouTube?
reliable books and websites. Like if you want to deal with geology and fossils and things like that, Ariel Roth from Loma Linda, Arthur Chadwick from Southwestern Adventist, have some great books, some great published papers in scientific journals that you can refer people to. Also, I have a website up. There's a number of other good websites that discuss all these things in detail. But if you want to just sit down yourself and explain it to somebody, you have to get your mind around it first, and that takes a lot of effort. Okay. So the stuff I presented today is like the tip of the iceberg for a lot of these topics.
We have another brave student here, Rahel.
Okay, so can you tell us about dinosaurs? Like, people believe different things about them. For one, there's people who believe that it wasn't really God who created them, but that people, they worked with DNA and stuff. About dinosaurs, and also people today believe that there's dinosaurs that are still alive. So I don't know. What do you think about those two things that have to do with them?
Yeah, that's another of my creationist friends. Creationists have written books on this, and I'm not going to mention names, but that dinosaurs were genetically manipulated before the flood and all these things. And, there's just no evidence. The way I look at it, the thing I'm favoring in my mind, and I can't prove any of this because there's just no evidence for it, but that there's some types of animals that never get old. They never stop growing and they never get old. It's called negligible senescence. They could be 500, you have a 500-year-old carp, and it still produces the same number of eggs, still just as vigorous, just as healthy. There's no tissue degeneration, the skin doesn't get thin, the scales don't fall off. Some turtles have this, negligible senescence. They get hundreds of years without showing any sign of aging. And let's say you had a lizard like that, or a crocodile, like crocodiles continue to grow their whole life. They never stop growing. And they can, if you got a 60-year-old, 70-year-old crocodile, you can have a couple tons there, it can get huge. And let's say before the flood, let's say animals had a similar lifespan to what the Bible describes humans of having, which is basically negligible senescence. You got a guy living 900 years that's negligible senescence, right? You're not getting old over time. Let's say lizards were doing the same thing, and they continue to grow the entire time. We are pygmies in comparison. Adam was probably, 14 feet tall, weighed a couple tons. Eve was probably 10 to 12 feet tall and weighed 1.5 tons. So for them, dealing with some of these creatures might not have been as big a deal, but for us, what they thought were like household pets, we would think it was terrifying beasts, So I think that the world before the flood was very different, and I'm not sure it was because part of the problem with Adventists in particular is that Ellen White uses this word amalgamation. She says there was an amalgamation of man and of beast. And so people assume that means man with beast. Like you make centaurs or whatever, the human heads and, combined with animal bodies or whatever. But I'm not sure that's what she meant. I'm not sure what she meant. No one really knows what she meant. Is it like people were playing around like crossbreeding or trying to actually merge humans with animals? It says of man and of beast. So it's almost like she's more concerned with intermarriage between believers in God and people who didn't believe in God, like the sons of Cain and with Seth and Cain, that they were intermarrying. She called that kind of a merging as well. So I'm not sure really what she meant, and I don't think there's really good evidence for that as far as where the dinosaurs came from. Maybe they were just created like that, but God, like she does say that some of the dinosaurs were not included on the ark because humans after the flood would not be able to handle them. The population wouldn't be there. They declined rapidly in physical and longevity as well. Physical strength and longevity wouldn't be able to handle some of these creatures. I wish he had done away with like the mosquito too while he was at it, but what good is some of these? Well, some mosquitoes are vegetarian, but like some of them are not. So I'm not sure. There's a lot of questions I'll have to ask God when I get to heaven. But
Okay.
these creationists come out and say, we definitively know that these are genetic manipulation. It's like, there's no evidence. Based on what? I don't know. So, sorry.
Okay, we have one from Dr. Harris. Then we have Dugo's coming up. Come on up. And you also have a question. Good. Some students here. It's called Stump the Doc.
Stump the Doc. Not too hard.
Just related to your talk this morning, the first one you gave on design and the intricacy of the universe, and you interviewed, there was one of the physicists that you showed being interviewed, and I was wondering, Lawrence Krauss is also a physicist. Have you ever heard him speak on how he deals with the design in the universe?
Yeah, they deal with it with that multiverse idea.
Okay.
Where they have an infinite number of universes and are just, everything extremely fine-tuned, but if you have an infinite number of universes, one of them is going to turn out right.
Okay.
That's how he deals with it.
So they don't deal with it. Go ahead, Dugo.
Thank you. So, in honor of asking questions, I thought of this, and I wanted to Google it first so I didn't ask a question that was, I could just Google. And what I found, you talked about antimatter, and I never actually looked up antimatter. I saw that there was like an antiproton for a hydrogen. Maybe Dr. Harris can answer this actually, but there's like an antiproton, an anti-electron, etc. And I was looking up antimatter, and it said that it had a specific heat. And I was wondering why that was, because each element has its own specific heat. So why does antimatter have a specific heat itself for like the whole?
It doesn't. Antimatter is identical in its specific heats for each different element. They're exactly identical, the only difference is charge. And that's part of what they were looking at with these hadron colliders and things, trying to find some tiny difference to explain why there's matter and no antimatter, and they haven't found anything yet.
Don't keep Googling.
Okay, so this is a question to do with, anyway, do you have any an explanation of how we ended up with so many different physical features or ethnicities, different types of nations, apart from environment? Did it have anything to do with Adam and Eve's like DNA? Did they have more variants, or I don't know?
It did, yeah. So if you take human or animal or anything and you breed it out for very specific traits too far, you can end up with an animal that doesn't survive very well, or even humans that don't survive very well, because they lose their ability to adapt. Like Dobermans, for example, are notorious for, as they get older, having very severe headaches and becoming more vicious, more violent as they get older. And that's a genetic trait that like a mutt doesn't have, a mongrel doesn't have, because it's too limited, its sequence space got too limited, and so it can't diverge far enough to overcome that because it's too finely bred out. So as far as actual differences between people, I do think it's environmentally based as far as the selection is concerned, or family based. But you can have people like my brother, for example. My father's black Irish. He's very dark skinned. He probably has darker skin than you have. And my mother is Lily Casper White, right? So I got my mother's skin, and my brother got my dad's skin. And so my brother is very dark and hairy, dark hair, dark skin. And I'm very, very light. I can think about the sun and get sunburnt. You know, so it's terrible. I wish it was the opposite way. And also his teeth are different. I have peg teeth, little tiny peg teeth. His teeth are normal. So I have canines, like I can shred meat, you know, they're really sharp. And those happen from the same two parents, right? And we got very different features from that. So, and if you select for that, let's say if some environment selects for that, some darker skin, like we end up in Australia or something, well, he's going to do better than I would, right? My offspring are doomed. So, it's just a front-loaded information, and you can get a huge variety really quick. So.
Students first. We have a curly-haired variety of student here. Please comment on the genetics that led to that. Was that part of the volcanic curl age?
No. My question is, what would you say about the megalodon sharks and how they became extinct?
Well, I'm not sure how they became extinct. Megalodon, the giant sharks, and maybe whatever they ate went extinct, you know, or there wasn't enough of it. I mean, they're huge. That's my best guess, but I don't know, obviously, for sure. A lot of animals, a lot of these big giant, we don't have 2-ton, critters digging around in our gardens anymore either, like those glyptogonts or whatever they're called, armadillos, and so maybe they just ran out of whatever they were. I know some of the animals got wiped out because they got possibly hunted to extinction, like the giant sloths and the giant dodo birds. I mean, you got free lunch right there that can't escape. So maybe that's part of it. But as far as the megalodons, I don't really know, except maybe they just didn't have enough to keep them going. And the biggest you can get nowadays is a great white shark.
Okay, what kind of questions should the students be asking you?
Questions that I know. No, like for me, the number one thing where the rubber meets the road and where you'll get the most headway, at least if somebody knows what you're talking about, is in genetics. Evolution happens or doesn't happen genetically. If you lose on that point, you're done. I mean, somebody may talk about fossils. That's what convinces most people is fossils when they lose on genetics or radiometric dating or whatever. They'll say, "What the fossil record?" Right? But you can say, "Look, where's the mechanism? How do you?" And so the best you can get, if you can convince them of the mechanism, like the Darwinian mechanism, random mutation, natural selection, it works, but it doesn't work well. It only works for very simple things, like 3-letter words. You get very far above that, it just stalls out. It stalls out exponentially. And that's pretty easy to explain to someone who understands what you're talking about genetically. However, what some people do, when I get them to that point, they start to agree, okay, I can understand that. What they do then is they say, well, maybe God stepped in and they helped them over these little steps, evolutionary steps. God it's theistic evolution, right? And so now that's a real problem for me, theistic evolution, because how can you argue, well, no, God didn't do that, right? So what I do with my theistic evolution for me is a no-go because, first of all, it's not consistent with the Bible. Second of all, it makes God look bad, right? You have a theistic evolutionary God where everything is based on suffering and death for millions and billions of animals. It's not consistent, at least with the biblical God, where the Bible describes God as being actually troubled when a sparrow falls wounded to the ground, and also concerned about the animals in Nineveh and telling Jonah, hey, look, there's a bunch of people there and there's a bunch of animals, right? That's unusual. For no other God, except for the Christian God, the biblical God, is concerned about animals like that. And he's like, a theistic God is just not the God of the Bible. right? A theistic God would not be concerned like that. Where the Bible is more consistent, says the human rebellion against God in the Garden of Eden and the moral fall affected the animal world. I'm not sure all the reasons for that, but except we were given dominion. And so it's at least internally consistent with the biblical story, that the animal world fell along with us because we had dominion over the whole world. And so at least it's more consistent that the world was much different before the fall. God never intended animal suffering or human suffering to ever take place. And if you have a theistic God, it makes him look evil. So that's one thing I would point out.
Another question back here. And so, like I was going to ask you, I'm not a student, but, I work here. But if you had to debate with the Pope who believes in theistic evolution, what would you say? And that's pretty much what you'd say, right? You'd say, hey, Francis,
for
what
the
about
Pope,
this?
I would start out with the Bible. I was like, hey, Francis, let's open up your Catholic Bible. I was like, explain to me the good God here with your theistic evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to say, well, how dare you judge God? I was like, well, the Bible itself calls us to judge God. This is another interesting thing. I had another friend of mine recently say that morality and love, we can't define it for ourselves. We have to let God define it for us, right? That's like, but God has given us ability to, like, for example, eternally burning fire, hellfire. Adventists don't believe that. We don't believe it's biblical, but even if I thought it might be biblical, and I thought that God might do that, to me it would be repulsive, right? Because I think God has given us an internal moral compass. Like, I do think it's derived from God. We can't totally rely on it for everything, but there's something so inherently bad, internally repulsive. You're just like, a good God would never do that, right? A good God would not torture somebody who lived 70 years on this planet for eternity, right? That just makes no sense. It's not rational, and it's evil. I would define that as evil. And I think, and we're called, even in the Bible that says that God is being brought, why do we have this great controversy, right? Who's on trial? Am I on trial? I'm not on trial, right? In the judgment, they're not going to be asking me questions. God's the one on trial, right? Before the whole universe. There's like, this whole great controversy is not for me, it's for the unfallen angels who were still sympathetic with Satan. He was like a really good guy. He had a lot of sympathy. And they're like, what's going on? Who's right? And Satan's saying one thing and Jesus is saying another. And God himself has placed himself on trial. He could have snapped his fingers and redone everything. No one would have known the difference. But he put himself on trial, which is another reason why I tend to believe him. Right? It's like, who does that? Who puts themselves on trial when you can just snap your fingers and start over? He could have wiped out everybody's memories, just wiped out Satan, wiped out everybody's memories. It would have been all cool, but who would have known the difference? He would have, right? So it's another reason why this whole great controversy, the fact that Jesus came and suffered and died, and the freedom of will and all these things, I tend to believe it because God himself has taken on put himself on trial where we judge God. And so I don't think it's totally wrong to say that a good God would never do something like that.
Okay, this is our last question because it is 3:30. We did make a solemn oath and commitment that we'd be done by 3:30. So this is our last question. I know some of you are sad. So please go to the front and ask him directly your question afterward. This is our last question.
Okay, hello. I have a question. What are your thoughts on the Yucatan meteorite, and does it have a connection to the flood?
The Yucatan what?
The Yucatan meteorite. It's a
meteorite.
That, supposedly hit the peninsula.
It's not the only one. There's big meteorites all around the world. That's just one example that we know of that was huge. It covered a third of the Gulf of Mexico. And if you have something like that hit, the pictures I showed you were artist renditions in scientific journals about that particular meteorite hitting the Yucatan, and the 2,000-foot wall of water that it would have generated, it would swamp the continent, and everybody agrees to that. They just think it happened many times over, spread out over millions of years. But I think it all happened catastrophically within that year time span. So,
thank you so much. How many have been blessed this weekend? How many want him to come back? I actually took all the air out of his tires. He's not going anywhere. No.
Thank you
No,
so much, guys, for having me.
And thank you for coming. Thank your wife. Thank your children. And you'll come back sometime, right?
It was a lot of fun. Yeah, thank you very
Good.
much.
Well, let's